The city of St. Louis was the northernmost slave port city. Being a major port on the nation's largest river, the Mississippi, St. Louis emerged as a critical center for all domestic trade, including the trafficking of human chattel. Despite its northern geographical location to other slave port cities, St. Louis was an integral slave city. Its position on the Mississippi River and its role as a trading post encouraged the institution of slavery and gave it sustenance. This documentary will focus on several locales within St. Louis where the enslaved resisted their diminished legal status to challenge the social order of things. These sites have rich stories and will be briefly shared to offer a unique perspective on slavery in St. Louis. Finally, we will look at these sites in our present world to determine if these sites have been properly memorialized and what more could be done to highlight their importance to American society. We begin our journey at the Bernard M. Lynch Slave Pens, located in antebellum downtown St. Louis. Slave dealing in St. Louis was a profitable business. One of the most active dealers was Bernard M. Lynch. He conducted business at 3 pens in the city during the 1850s. His last building stood on the corners of 5th and Myrtle and was considered his best. Lynch praised his slave pens as comfortable quarters under secure fastening where slaves would have a good yard for their accommodations. He generally collected a 25-cent charge for board and extracted sizable commissions for his services after slaves were sold.
So in St. Louis, there was one business that held slaves until they were taken for auction, and that was the Bernard Lynch slave pens. The Lynch Slave Pens were located on what is now Ballpark Village in downtown St. Louis, so it's right next to Busch Stadium. The actual building, interestingly, wasn't demolished until the 1960s, so there are lots of pictures of it. And it was a 2-story building with wrought iron bar cages basically on the first level. I guess there was offices on the second floor, and there was a basement. And typically, if you had a slave that you wanted to sell, you would put him or her in the Lynch Slave Pens for no more than a week, and potential buyers could inspect the merchandise, and then they'd be marched down to the old courthouse where they would be auctioned off officially, and all the records would be signed.
When the Civil War began in 1861, Lynch shut up his pen. Military authorities seized the former pens and transformed them into a military prison.
The last slave sale in St. Louis occurred right at the beginning of the Civil War in January of 1861, and not long after that, the federal government took over and declared martial law in the city, and that pretty much shut down that kind of business. As the war progressed, the Lynch Slave Pens would be used to hold Confederate prisoners or Confederate sympathizers in the city of St. Louis who might have been seen as fifth columnists.
By February 1864, the prison was so filthy and derelict that many whites in the city, including Union sympathizers, were calling for the prison to be decommissioned.
The outcry about the treatment of white prisoners would have to be compared with the way the slaves were treated. And I think in the Civil War period, many whites who weren't pro-slavery still harbored strong prejudices towards black people. So what does that say? I think that says that even if you're a unionist and you're anti-slavery, you may be very prejudiced.
The unique history of a former slave pen becoming a prison for Confederate sympathizers reveals just how complicated the slavery narrative is in St. Louis. The old St. Louis courthouse was built as a federal and state courthouse. It served a pivotal role in the shaping of St. Louis laws. It was also important in commerce as slaves and goods were sold in auctions on its east steps for estate settlements. These annual auctions occurred usually on New Year's Day. The selling of slaves by auction was very unpopular to many of the citizens of St. Louis, specifically during the years immediately prior to the Civil War. The last auction on the courthouse steps did not go exactly as planned. On January 1st, 1861, newspaper accounts of that day highlight the resiliency of the abolitionist movement. "How much am I offered," he shouted, "for this bright and able-bodied boy?" $3, mister! The bid was, of course, ridiculously low, but it didn't stop with the first shout. It was repeated and became a chant. $3! $3! $3! The crowd seemed to have been rehearsed. As the price only rose to $4 in an hour, the auctioneer knew that he was in for an experience. He tried a new tack. This, he asserted, was no joking matter. "Give me a bid for this one, strong and willing and young," he pleaded. He did not have to wait long. The crowd was ready. It raised its bid. $5! The auction was canceled, and that was the end of slave auctions in St. Louis. Bells rang out. Merry calls of ceremony were made, but the holdover slaves were still sold down the river. John Barry Meacham was born a slave in Virginia in 1789. During his spare time, he worked mining saltpeter until he raised enough money to buy his freedom. In 1815, his wife and children were brought to Missouri by their owner, and Meacham followed them there. He arrived in St. Louis with only $3 in his pocket, but began working as a cooper until he was able to earn enough money to buy their freedom. He opened a barrel factory that became a thriving business. While he undertook these tasks, Meacham met two Welsh missionaries that taught him to read and write. They convinced him that the best way to lift his people out of their oppression was through education. In 1825, Meacham was ordained as a minister and entered into a new era of his life. He would become the pastor of the First African Baptist Church in St. Louis. When the church was erected, Meacham and other missionaries operated a school in the basement under the guise of a Sunday school. This clandestine school taught free blacks and slaves to read and write. The masters of Meacham's slave parishioners didn't mind them going to church to hear lessons of hard work and obedience. They were completely unaware of the school. The police became aware of it and shut it down.
In the early 19th century, there were a number of slave revolts which scared the hell out of white Southerners and slave owners in general. The Nat Turner Rebellion, Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, Charleston, South Carolina. These things created regional, if not national, hysteria. There was real concern about the power and influence of free blacks to aid in these. And also, when you get down to the issue of education, I think that there is somewhat of a concern that blacks might rise up socially and be competitive with whites in the South.
In 1847, laws in the state of Missouri made it illegal to educate blacks anywhere in Missouri. Undeterred by these laws, Reverend Meacham purchased a steamboat and equipped it with a library to make a new type of school for slaves and free blacks. To operate the boat as a school, Meacham anchored it in the middle of the river. Since the Mississippi is considered federal waters, Missouri's laws against the education of blacks and slaves could not be applied to any vessel anchored in it. Therefore, students would board a skiff every morning to head out to school. Meacham called this school the Freedom School. During the 1840s and 50s, hundreds of Negro children learned their 3 R's in the middle of the Mississippi River. It became famous throughout the nation, with teachers from the East coming to help as much as they could. The Freedom School lasted until Meacham's death in 1854. In the early hours of May 21st, 1855, a party of enslaved Africans boarded a skiff on the Mississippi riverfront north of St. Louis. When they reached the Illinois side, the plan was that wagons would continue them on their path to freedom. The skiff landed safely. The police were told that a skiff containing about 9 slaves was due to cross the river. They opened fire. 5 runaways were caught that morning. 1 was able to escape. One of the slaves told the police that the place of planning was Mary Meacham's home, the widow of John Barry Meacham. Mary Meacham was arrested and thrown in jail.
So, John Barry Meacham and Mary Meacham were free blacks in the city of St. Louis, and as free blacks, they were always suspect whenever there was a runaway slave. This would be one of the first places that the bounty hunters would visit, would be their home. They probably were involved with the Underground Railroad, but you can understand why there wouldn't be a lot of documentation about their specific activities, that this was a federal crime if they were found guilty. So, in the case of runaway slaves heading to Illinois from the north side of St. Louis, she was implicated. Back then, as is today, if you're implicated but there's not enough evidence, then you've got to acquit. So they were the Meacham family was heavily scrutinized, but there wasn't enough to put them in jail.
Born in Southampton County, Virginia in the late 1790s as the property of Peter Blow, Dred Scott came with his master to Missouri, settling in St. Louis in 1830. When his master found himself strapped financially, he sold Dred Scott to Dr. John Emerson, a physician then residing in St. Louis. Emerson embarked on a military career that took him among many states and territories, including the Free State of Illinois. Scott went along on these trips until 1842. Then, on April 6, 1846, Dred and his wife, Harriet, sued their mistress, Irene Emerson, for freedom, initiating litigation in the local Missouri State Circuit Court that would take 11 years to ultimately decide. Dred Scott's case was not unique in Missouri. Many slaves had successfully sued for manumission, as Missouri law stated that any slave taken to a free state or territory is granted free status in Missouri. In the Dred Scott case, the question became whether freedom could be lost by returning to a slave state as someone's property. Since Dred Scott and his wife had been taken to free territories, the facts in the case were not in dispute. When Dred Scott brought his suit before the district court at the old courthouse, Scott won the case. However, Emerson's widow appealed the case to the Missouri Supreme Court in 1852. If she won the case, not only would Dred Scott have value for her as a slave, years of wages would be rewarded to her that was in escrow until his legal status was resolved. The Missouri Supreme Court reversed the judgment and declared Dred Scott a slave. Ignoring previous legal precedents, the court justified this turnabout as a response to the growing national campaign to abolish slavery. When Scott appealed this decision to the Supreme Court, this was precisely when the court wanted to decide once and for all how slavery would be addressed in the nation. The court ruled on March 6, 1857. 7 of 9 justices agreed that Dred Scott should remain a slave.
The attorney who took the case to the Supreme Court was Montgomery Blair, who would later be Lincoln's Postmaster General, but he was a St. Louis guy. And he came from a family that were the top fundraisers for Lincoln for president in 1860.
Chief Justice Roger Taney, writing for the court, said that blacks were not included in the phrase, "We the people of the United States."
Most historians consider it to be one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in history. Not only did it nullify previous rulings by the courts and put Scott back into bondage, but it went so far as to say that all northern states and territories were open to the movement of slaves as property, so that there was no limit as there previously had been.
Abolitionists feared that slavery would now be able to spread unchecked. This fear promoted the new Republican Party, whose platform was to prohibit the spread of slavery.
If you're an abolitionist, what you're thinking is, this goes all the way up to the highest court in the country, and they made a terrible decision, that there would seem to be very little hope for us peacefully resolving the issue of slavery. So if you're hoping that the justice system will play its role and the proper outcome would eventually arrive, they'd arrive at the proper outcome, you're really disappointed.
the Dred Scott decision moved the country to the brink of civil war. After the Scots lost their freedom effort in the court, their last owner, Taylor Blow, freed them. Dred Scott died less than a year after being granted his freedom.
The star-spangled red, white, and blue. We'll fight till our cause is victory.
While these stories are unique to St. Louis, they offer documented examples of resistance during the antebellum period. While modernization often leads to change in topography, these sites are significant to St. Louis's local history and should be preserved. The location of the Lynch Slave Pen site does not have any markers or preservation. This is now Ballpark Village, an area of commercialization that the St. Louis Cardinals used to line their coffers during and after the baseball season. There is no evidence whatsoever that this site was once a place where slave pens existed. Dred Scott and the old courthouse share a similar fate in their preservation. The old courthouse is now a tourist site and part of the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial administered by the National Park Service. The courtroom where the Dred Scott case was heard is no longer in existence. In 1855, the courthouse received extensive renovations, and the area where the courtroom was located was not preserved. There is a recreation of the courtroom in the current courthouse, and the privately funded Dred Scott Foundation has purchased a statue that sits south of the courthouse steps to commemorate Dred and Harriet Scott's story. However, there are no markers that tell the story of the slave auctions that occurred on these steps. Reenactments of the slave auctions by historians are sanctioned by the National Park Service, usually on New Year's Day. John Barry Meacham's Freedom School moved ashore and was set up in his church in the aftermath of the Civil War. This school was later chosen by the St. Louis School Board to be the first public school for blacks. There are no markers along the river that tell the story of the Freedom School. The Freedom Crossing is the most marked and preserved site mentioned in the video. In 2001, the National Park Service, in association with local partners, named the steps taken by the enslaved escapees the Mary Meacham Freedom Crossing in an elaborate ceremony. This became the first Underground Railroad site in Missouri, the first site along the Mississippi River, and one of only a handful of documented Underground Railroad sites outside of the southern slave states.
I visited this site in preparation of the documentary, and as I stood at the steps looking down into the Mississippi River, I desperately wanted to climb down and experience this living history underneath my feet. As I tried to safely navigate my way to the river's edge, the earth seemed to shift underneath my feet. Startled, I was too fearful of being able to pull my way back up to continue. Since the site was marked, I was able, for a moment, to visualize this experience, and became more real to me than anything I could read in a book or see on film. I closed this documentary asking the question that our instructor asked in class earlier this semester. Do we memorialize slavery properly in America? I will let Dr. Elsesser close with his thoughts that I also echo.
Okay, so does our society memorialize slavery appropriately? Yes and no. There's not a consistent treatment of the slavery issue in America. I've been to plantations down south where you go on the tours and they're very upfront about the work conditions, the living conditions, and they don't pull punches when they describe the agonies of day-to-day life for these slaves. Here in St. Louis, I can tell you about I can give you two examples of how I think the legacy of slavery has been kind of swept under the rug. First of all, in St. Louis, in Forest Park, there is a Confederate memorial. It was erected right around the turn of the century by the Daughters of the Confederacy to talk about their, the veterans who were beginning to die out at the end of the 19th century. And there's a lot of waxing nostalgic about how just the Confederate cause was. But if you read the plaque in Forest Park, there's not a single mention of slavery. And it's kind of like, what the hell were they fighting for? They were fighting for their freedom. They were fighting for their land. No, they were fighting for the right to property, which included people. And that's all been just kind of cleaned up and brushed away. There's an interesting case more recently that occurred out in Baldwin, Missouri, which is a suburb. In the 19th century, this would have been farmland. And today it's suburban subdivisions. And the developer who built the houses out there back in the 1970s knew that there was a slave cemetery near the development. And so he named the road letting into the subdivision Old Slave Road. And just last year, one of the residents of that subdivision petitioned the city of Baldwin to change the name. She said that she was embarrassed, and every time people sent Christmas cards, you're like, really? You live on Old Slave Road? This is a white woman who just thought maybe we should update the name into something a little bit less hurtful in our memory. So she was petitioning to change it, and interestingly enough, the community, whites and blacks, got together and said, no, keep it. It's part of our history, and we shouldn't try to brush it aside or ignore it. And so today, it's still Old Slave Road.